and an activist and an advocate for science and critical thinking. Tonight he's speaking with us on the topic of psychological pseudoscience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sheldon Helms.
We just have to get you mic'd up, so give me just a moment, please. Thank you. Smooth transition. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? That's a terrible way to start a talk. Eugenie Scott's always told me, stop saying can they hear you. They'll tell you if they can hear you. So I apologize for that. Thank you for coming out. What are we doing? What? I don't know what a 3.5 inch is. It looks like it.
I just wanted to make sure you had the video on.
Oh, I think we're good. Yeah. Okay. So thanks for coming out. I am assuming that most of you are not rabid baseball fans. Okay. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm sit there with my husband and go, sports harder. And he's like, just leave. Leave me alone. I want to watch my Giants. So thank you for coming out, and thank you for your kind attention this evening. And it's wonderful to be here amongst a group of people that are so active. I don't often run across people in the field of skepticism and atheism. I'm one of the people that is a strong advocate for building that bridge. You would think it would be a perfect marriage, right? Because if you're a skeptic, why wouldn't you also be a skeptic about the ultimate claim, which is there is a God? I think that's a claim, and I think that claim needs to be challenged from time to time. So I applaud all of you for taking part in that challenge constantly in your lives, and I know it's not an easy one for everyone. I happen to be lucky in this regard because I have tenure. So we can pretty much do it. So as long as I don't kill one of them, I've got a job for life. So I teach psychology for a living, and I always like to start out this talk by letting you know that I have a great deal of respect for the field of psychology. I have either studied or worked within psychology for nearly half of my life. I taught psychology for 18 years. 14 of those have been at Ohlone College, which I love. I'm very lucky to have the job that I do and to have the wonderful students that I have and to have the opportunity to spread information to you about the field of psychology. My presentation tonight is not meant to turn you away from the field of psychology in any way. In fact, I often like to say that not only is psychology my passion, but it's also the framework through which I view my skepticism and my atheism. I borrow from the field of psychology all the time to ask myself, do I believe in this? Is there evidence for this, etc.? So I have a great deal of respect for psychology. I have so much respect, as a matter of fact, that I challenge psychological claims. And I think we need to see more of that. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we continue in my talk tonight. So what I'm trying to do is warn my colleagues, my friends like you, consumers of psychological science, against what I see as pseudoscience within the field. So since my presentation tonight is about pseudoscience, I think it makes sense that, first of all, I should tell you what I mean by that. Pseudoscience is characterized by a number of things, but basically it's 4 different things. One of them, as you see here, is the use of vague, contradictory, exaggerated, or unprovable claims. We also tend to see an over-reliance on confirmation, which is not what we do in science. What you should be doing is trying to refute your own theory. We also tend to see a lack of openness to evaluation. People who promote pseudoscience do not like to be challenged in their pseudoscientific claims. And lastly, an absence of systematic processes that develop theories and further theory. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about 3 areas of psychological pseudoscience. One of them is fringe psychology. You should keep in mind, by the way, before I go into that every science has its wackos. You know this, right? Medicine has things like chiropractic and homeopathy, and as we saw earlier, Pat Robertson, clearly a medical guy. What? Towels with HIV, that's a new one. We have people in the engineering that challenge the World Trade Center collapse. Those are engineers sometimes. They're not right, but they're engineers. Anthropologists certainly have their creationists. So it's not just us in the field of psychology who have people who fall outside the realms of science. Psychology, however, I would say is notable in some ways. And one of those ways is the degree to which people infiltrate the mainstream with these ideas, at least for a time, sometimes for a really long time. And so we see people in fringe psychology, for instance, who try to promote ideas that, or techniques in some cases, that gain a following in psychology but lack a basis for effectiveness or for truth. So I'm just going to call that fringe psychology completely. Next, I'm going to talk about examples of what I consider mainstream psychology, singling out one in particular for close examination. In this case, you probably will have heard of these before, and some of them might actually have some small degree of merit to them. But when you examine them closely, they start to fall apart, at least in the way that people tend to believe in them. And lastly, a somewhat more controversial topic that I call bad teaching as pseudoscience. Here I'll illustrate how teachers, even those who teach in the field of psychology, can create misunderstanding and spread untruths about studies, even classic studies in psychology, because they misunderstand them and they spread that misunderstanding. So I'm going to present that as a type of pseudoscience as well. So, starting about in the 1960s, coming on the heels of all the social changes that were happening at that time in the Western world, the field of psychology, as you probably are aware, underwent dramatic changes. For the first time, certain topics within the field were fair game for study. Things like sexuality, gender, race, and other aspects of human behavior that weren't studied before suddenly were. Coming along with that, unfortunately, was a great deal of different, we'll call them, psychotherapies that probably were floundering around, trying to separate themselves from the stiff, stilted century of Freudian psychotherapy, which we all know is also called bullshit. So, some of these include things like rebirthing therapy. I swear to you, this is real. People actually engage in this. They wrap you up like a burrito, and then they pretend that you're being born again. Not in the Christian sense, in the literal sense. By the way, children have been suffocated this way. Yeah, so this is a very serious thing as well as a obviously ridiculous thing. There's also things like aromatherapy. We all like to smell nice things, right? It won't cure your schizophrenia. So they say, smell this, don't you feel better? This is complete fraud. And one of my favorites is called primal scream therapy. Check this out. Yeah, so they literally just sit and, like, it's cathartic, right? They scream their heads off, and this is supposed to be therapeutic. It's laughable, but it's ridiculous, right? So these are not your father's psychotherapy, obviously. Most of them gained a small following and then petered out. Sometimes people still offer their books, and maybe they make a little bit of money that way, but they're not really all that important. Since that time, however, other fringe psychotherapies have been introduced to an unsuspecting public that are just as pseudoscientific, but a lot longer lived. And some of them have even made their way into the classroom curriculum, which is of great concern to me. In this section, I'll highlight two of these, both of which purport to be effective in treating a wide array of psychological problems, but concentrate in one area in particular, and that is post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is a very serious psychological, usually trauma-related disorder that can occur as a result of things involving death or injury or violence, extreme emotional situations. And I'm sure you're all aware of PTSD. So it can be crippling anxiety, hypervigilance, flashbacks to the event, and people really suffer. So we need to make sure, I think, as a society, that these folks actually get real help. So what is real help? I'll tell you first about that. What helps probably better than most things is cognitive behavior therapy. And this involves three basic procedures that real psychotherapists use. One of them is called exposure, and this is real or imagined exposure to whatever the trigger stimulus is, the object, the situation, the thought, the memory, etc. This habituates people by giving them opportunities to be in the presence of the trigger for prolonged periods of time and eventually to have less and less emotional reaction to it. It also involves cognitive therapy. This is engaging your clients in Socratic dialogue that challenges the validity of their beliefs that's leading them to the trauma. and also anxiety management training, which is also known as stress inoculation. So it includes relaxation training, breathing retraining, psychoeducation, and self-instruction coaching. So this is very, very effective. Stands in stark contrast to the psychotherapies that I'm going to tell you about next. One of them is EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. This is its creator, Francine Shapiro. You'll get to laugh at her in a moment. She discovered the technique by what we refer to as the phenomenological approach, which is not in itself a bad idea. The idea here is you have a personal experience, and then that sparks some idea, and then you, hopefully, if you're a real scientist, go on to sort of collect the evidence to see whether or not you're on the right track. Francine got off kilter somehow here. As she tells it, she says she was on a walk one day and she was thinking about a particularly troubling experience, and suddenly she noticed that her eyes would, I'm not making this up by the way, but her eyes would dart around all over the place, and after they did that, she felt better. Okay? So she decided to start looking into this for herself. And she said, okay, well, I'll think of another troubling experience. And so she did that again, and her eyes kind of darted around hither and thither, as they say. Who says hither and thither? So hither and thither and up and down in this very specific way. And she said, I'll be darned, I feel better after I move my eyes like that. So as her doctoral idea for her doctoral dissertation, she wrote up this whole new type of psychotherapy and soon started spreading the word to other people. God love us. So since that time, EMDR has blossomed into this whole movement with 30,000 clinicians trained in this stuff so far. We have a huge international association that holds an annual conference every year with hundreds of attendees. They have a highly successful, well-funded international aid foundation. In the 1990s, the news magazine show 2020 aired an expose on EMDR that amounted to a primetime advertisement for this new fledgling psychotherapy and catapulted Francine Shapiro to stardom. Here's a somewhat edited version of that report for you to watch.
And now, the mysterious human mind. We're going to show you an exciting breakthrough, a novel therapy that's being talked about and tried across the country. It's a way for people to free themselves from destructive memories, and it seems to work, even in cases where years of conventional therapy have failed. No one understands exactly why this method succeeds, only that it does. So how does it work? Well, join Lynn Scher on a fascinating odyssey, the healing of a troubled mind.
You are looking at a radical new form of psychotherapy. The key is the patient's eyes, shifting back and forth in a process that mysteriously unlocks the trauma of times past. Trauma like war. Eric Smith spent only 9 months in Vietnam, but for decades the war tormented him. His body had survived. His mind was something else.
There were 6 incidents in Vietnam with people getting killed. I had decided that had I done more, they wouldn't have gotten killed. Emotionally, I was a mess. I was severely depressed for over 20 years. It was difficult just to get up in the morning and eat, get dressed, and go to work.
Then Eric discovered a new and unique kind of therapy. It's called EMDR, Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. It's being practiced by some 7,000 therapists across the country, and the numbers are growing. It's a combination of traditional talk therapy with something that sounds bizarre. Here's how it works. The therapist rapidly moves his or her fingers, or an object like a wand, before the patient's eyes for several seconds at a time, while the patient talks about an upsetting image. We can't show you the actual hand movements because therapists are concerned that untrained people improperly mimicking the technique might possibly cause harm. But we can give you a pretty good sense of it. This is an actual EMDR session.
Okay.
The therapist who is facing us is about to start.
Okay, just notice that.
The client is dealing with panic attacks. Look at his eyes and watch how they follow the therapist's wand, and how, after he does this for several seconds, he gets very emotional. The procedure is repeated several times in the session, along with more traditional therapy. This eye movement technique was developed by Dr. Francine Shapiro. While on a walk one day, she noticed that when she thought about something disturbing, her eyes moved in a certain way, and then the thought no longer upset her.
Then I started doing it deliberately to see if it would work, and the same thing happened. The thought shifted away. When I brought it back, it wasn't as disturbing.
If I had seen you that day in the park, what would I have noticed about your eyes?
That they were moving very rapidly in a diagonal, just flickering up and down very, very rapidly. So I thought I stumbled upon some mind process that worked with thoughts. And that's what was so fascinating, because I hadn't been doing it deliberately, but I noticed it happening.
Now, translating this into something you could use on other people, you found what? People's eyes couldn't move that way by instinct or naturally?
Right, and I had to start using my hand to guide them to make similar types of eye movement.
Dr. Shapiro isn't sure why eye movements are effective. Critics have questioned whether EMDR is the snake oil for the 90s, charging that controlled studies are lacking, with no scientific basis to call EMDR an effective innovation. But don't try telling that to Eric Smith. He spent 20 years trying to cope with memories of Vietnam without success. He even considered suicide.
And I decided that night that I had taken lives and that I did not deserve to be here. And I was just tired, I couldn't run anymore.
He was desperate to find something that might relieve his suffering. And despite qualms about trying something that sounded so strange, Eric Smith decided to see Dr. Shapiro and try EMDR.
I thought, what the heck is this going to do? I've been working hard for years trying to get rid of this stuff with a lot of good people that have a lot of experience. It was so difficult to believe or to understand. She started working with me, and I started feeling better, and it would stick. It would stay. It wouldn't, 2 or 3 weeks later, stuff wouldn't come back. It wouldn't bother me. I've been working on this stuff for years prior to working with her, and within 2 or 3 or 4 sessions, we had resolved issues that I'd been discussing for 4 or 5 years with other people.
Are you concerned that some people will see this as a wonder cure? Is it a quick fix?
No, it goes along. It's hard work. It takes a good amount of clinical skills in order to implement it. And this isn't just touch the person's forehead and they get better.
Well, I agree. It's not just touch the person's forehead and get better. And I certainly don't want Eric Smith to suffer. If he's getting some benefit out of this, I would never, and I would hope you wouldn't, take this away from him. However, for future sufferers of PTSD, I think it warrants us looking a little more closely at these techniques and finding out what parts work, what parts don't. What therapies are best, which ones probably are a waste of time and money, etc. So please don't think that I'm ridiculing the people who are suffering. I certainly am not, and I don't want them to suffer further. But I think Francine Shapiro is incorrect, and I have evidence to back up my claim. Before I do that, however, I want to tell you about the second friend psychotherapy I'll talk about tonight. She's mentioned tapping the forehead, by the way. It's kind of ironic, because this one involves tapping your body. Applause for laughter. This is called thought field therapy, y'all. You're not going to believe this one. So, this is its creator, Roger Callahan, used to be called the Callahan technique, by the way. It is to psychotherapy what acupuncture and acupressure are to medicine. According to Callahan, brace yourself, psychological and emotional states create a field of energy around us. Magnetic energy, sometimes it's called a gravitational field. I would think we could probably test for this. We have, it's not there. And it can be manipulated by a series of taps on certain areas on the body at certain times. And that breaks up the field, and then the psychological problem dissipates with help. Yeah, like other forms of energy therapy, this one suffers from a lack of scientific evidence. The first one being that any such energy field actually exists. So Figley and Carbonell back in 1999 proposed, say the proponents based claims of efficacy when we asked for this on only 4 published studies. Only one of them was actually in a peer-reviewed journal, and you think, okay, one, what's that all about? It turns out that it consisted exclusively of a sample of callers to talk radio programs. How this ever got past an IRB is just beyond me. How it ever got published is beyond me. So, of course, that hasn't stopped TFT from becoming hugely popular. What concerns me the most is not only their internet promotions and their marketing by clinicians that jumped significantly in the wake of 9/11, but also after Hurricane Katrina, they sent hundreds of these TFT practitioners down to ostensibly help people with the trauma. That concerns me greatly because those folks probably really were suffering from psychological and emotional trauma. So I found on the internet this wonderful woman. She's not wonderful in that she's good at what she does. She's wonderfully humorous. She's going to teach us a little bit about how to do TFT. Brace yourselves.
Hello, this is Katerina Flori, founder of Fit for the Job. Thank you for joining me on this personal development journey. The technique for today, it's a very powerful technique for reducing and eliminating anxiety and stress. And it comes from thought field therapy, a technology that has been invented and further developed by Dr. Roger Callahan. Before you start doing the procedure, you tune into that thought that triggers the anxiety in you, and you rate the level of anxiety that you experience on a scale of 0 to 10. 0, there's no anxiety. 10, you experience an intense level of anxiety. The reason for doing this is that you might want to track your progress after doing this technique. So you correct for psychological reversal, and then you do the procedure. I'm going to show you the procedure, then explain it. I'm just here for 5 minutes. And take a new reading on a scale of 0 to 10. If the level of anxiety is 0, or is to a level that you feel comfortable with, go ahead and do your activities and be much more productive. If not, you might want to repeat the whole procedure again and take a new reading.
I've just saved you weeks of therapy. Just tap it. I can't help but think of like monkeys when she does this. Like, right? I mean, it's silly, of course, but in some ways it's not silly too, because keep in mind that we look at this and we're probably, I would say, maybe a little more educated than the rest of the populace around us. Can I say that proudly? Yes, I think we are. And so we probably look at this and we go, you know what, I'm not going to fall for that. But people do. Sometimes people's only currency with psychotherapy is watching a few episodes of Oprah. You know, when it comes to psychology, not everyone is as educated as the people in this room likely are. And so they fall prey to this. And I think it's our responsibility as good skeptics to go out there and spread the word and tell people, maybe you might want to look into that a little more closely. So let's do that, shall we? And it won't take very long. I know, you're thinking, oh geez, am I in Psych 101 now? What's he doing with the charts? Very simple. Look over on the left and you see procedures, exposure, cognitive therapy, anxiety management, eye movements, body tapping. Sounds familiar to you now, right? So let's look at each column, shall we? Now, each of these, EMDR and TFT, utilize all of these things. Exposure therapy, cognitive therapy, anxiety management. They just happen to add on a little something extra. So that's what we find when we look into this. In fact, even Francine Shapiro herself admitted it in a 1996 personal correspondence with psychologist Jeffrey M. Lahr. She said, and I quote, "Eye movement is merely one component of a complex method that combines aspects of many of the major modalities. Remove the eye movement and there is still a very powerful method." I agree with her. It's called cognitive behavior therapy. Thank you very much. If you add in a little tapping, a little eye movement or whatever, but they're probably doing any success that they get is coming out of what they're doing behind the scenes, which is cognitive behavior therapy, exposure therapy, etc. So that's my explanation for that to her. So So those are fringe psychological things. You may never meet a proponent of these. If you do, God help you. But they're very into it. EMDR people especially. I cannot have conversations with people who are into EMDR, especially the patients, because they're very much into it. If you think religious people are bad, try people who are the followers of something that's a fringe psychotherapy. Just walk away. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about mainstream psychology. So in this case, we're talking about things that probably you've heard of before. Now, we could have very serious discussions, and I could give you a whole lecture if you wanted to, on the limits of placebo effects. In fact, Harriet Hall, who's known as the Skepdoc, says we need to stop calling it the placebo effect and refer to it as this placebo phenomenon, because there isn't an effect. You can't cure medical problems with placebos. You can get a psychological effect, but even that's not nearly as powerful as many people think that it is. We look at things like lie detectors. They're nothing of the sort, right? They're actually just processing a shot of adrenaline, and they increase your autonomic arousal, and sometimes it happens when you lie. It can also happen when you're scared, when you're angry, all kinds of other things. And then when it comes to eyewitness testimony, if you want to just completely give up the ghost on eyewitness testimony, read anything by Elizabeth Loftus. She's the woman who is the foremost authority in our country anyway on false memory syndrome. That will scare the hell out of you. So we could have very serious discussions about these, indeed, but where we can't have a discussion, in my opinion, is when we talk about this. Because suddenly we're way into the fringe mainstreamy stuff. This is Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm sure you've all heard of AA before. Alcoholics Anonymous is by far the largest self-help group in the world, with nearly 2 million members and 87,000 chapters worldwide. It was founded in the 1930s by these two guys here, Dr. Bob Smith and Bill Wilson, both alcoholics who quit drinking in 1935 and apparently never drank again. Like AA itself, Smith and Wilson's sobriety was of a highly religious nature. While hospitalized for treatment of alcoholism, Wilson experienced sickness like he had never felt before. And he later claimed in his writings that in this state of disorientation and suffering, he suddenly sat up in bed and screamed out, "I'll do anything, anything at all. If there be a God, let him show himself." This is the birthplace of AA, by the way, this statement, because he said suddenly he saw a sensation of bright light. Oh, Jesus, it's happening now. A sensation of bright light. He said he felt an ecstasy wash over him and a new kind of serenity in his words, and he never drank again for the rest of his life. So, turns out, if you look more closely at this, he was actually being hospitalized because he was undergoing the belladonna cure. So he wasn't just sitting in a hospital bed going through DTs. Instead, he was being slowly poisoned with certain deliriants, including deadly nightshade, strychnine, and mercury. This was the belladonna cure for alcoholism at the time in the 1930s. Guess what the side effects are? Seeing bright lights, feeling a sense of ecstasy come over you, serenity, hallucination, sounding familiar? Yeah. So, yeah, I'll just leave your imaginations for that. Regardless, Wilson came to believe, I know you can't read that, I'll talk about it in a minute, you don't have to read it, those are the 12 steps. He came to believe that his liberation from alcoholism was a gift from God. And he soon started attempts to spread the word to other people. Eventually he ran across Dr. Bob Smith, who was also an alcoholic, and although he had been suffering from alcoholism his entire adult life, he was a very successful doctor and surgeon. And the two met, and they hit it off immediately. They had a lot in common. They had both struggled with alcoholism for years. They said their first encounter was an hours-long conversation over pots of coffee till the wee hours of the morning. And by the end of that, Wilson asked Smith, he assured him that he could help, and he asked him, "So Bob, do you know any drunks?" And to which Bob Smith replied, "Are you kidding, Bill? I know them all." So they started a movement. This began by far the single largest self-help organization in human history, founded upon these 12 steps. You probably know them very well, or at least you've heard about them, especially being an anti-religious group. You know something that many people don't, which is how often God comes up in them. looking at this list, and I've highlighted power, God, praying, God, spiritual awakening, etc. It's really hard to imagine that AA maintains its position that it is not a religious organization. Really? Because we can read. I've even heard some people say, well, your higher power can be anything. It could even get a big bang. That's really creative. But no. Sorry, I'm not going there. 7 of the 12 steps list God or something religious. So it's not surprising, by the way, because at the time both Wilson and Smith were involved with a group called the Oxford Group, which was a Christian missionary group. And their organization was dedicated to social change through ministry. And these were their 5 C's: confession, conviction, conversion, continuance. The 12 steps are these 5 steps elongated. That's all they are. That's why it is religious. It was started by a religious organization. According to the Oxford Group, by the way, the reason that you are addicted is you are a moral failure. And that is still the message, I would say, that is sent as an undertone, a very powerful undertone within Alcoholics Anonymous. They believed that you could only be cured of alcoholism through God, and the work of the life changer had to be done under God's direction, and more importantly than anything else, a complete and utter surrender of your power. I cannot express enough how this is the antithesis of everything we learn in practicum training in psychology, everything we learn in psychology classes. You do not tell the client to give up his or her power. In fact, you do the opposite. You try to empower the person. But look how often this comes up. Even in the very first step, they say, you are powerless over alcohol. The second one, a power greater than yourself can restore you to sanity, etc., etc. This is not psychotherapy. In fact, it's not even effective. And that may surprise some of you. I'll talk to you about the statistics in a moment. Smith did some research back in the 1980s, and what he found in a couple of different studies was that it probably was pretty effective. He said in this group of 78 women and 137 men compared to a control group that was similar, 79% of the women effectively overcame their alcoholism, and 61% of the men, compared to only 3 and 5% of the control group, respectively. But later analysis of their data found that Alcoholics Anonymous was not the only treatment method being used. There was a much broader psychotherapeutic method being used here, and that just dirties up the research completely. So we can't really put a lot of stock into this as scientists. What we can do, however, is look at this research by Tonningen and others back in 2000. And what he and his colleagues found was that the most significant outcome factor was the client's rating of the conceptual and spiritual underpinnings of Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, this leaves out huge swaths of people who maybe don't believe in a higher power, or probably more people would just rather have psychotherapy that actually is effective, whether they believe in a God or not. Here's a small video clip of a friend of mine, Alan Beth Walks. She's a very well-known atheist as well, and she's going to talk a little bit about her struggles with addiction and how she overcame it. There's a happy ending here, but there's no God involved.
For 23 years, I heard from, I don't know, countless people that if you don't find God, you will not stay sober. If you do not find God, then you are not recovered. I was raised by a conservative Jewish family, and I was expected to do the bat mitzvah bid, and I was sent to Hebrew school, and didn't really get into it, and I cut as often as possible. Once I rebelled against my parents and Judaism, it wasn't so much as that I really thought too much about religion at that point. I was into my own little world and universe and had problems with alcohol. And when you have problems with alcohol, there's only really one place to turn, and that's AA. And when you turn to AA, you have to turn to God. Over and over, I was told that if you are not spiritual, you are not sober. So for a very long time, I outright lied. I told them I believed in God. I told them I was spiritual. I told them that I was doing the steps. And I felt like the biggest fraud. What I saw in AA is people being told that they have to surrender to win, that they are powerless over their own choices, that they have to turn their will and their life over the care of God as they understand Him, that they are not responsible for what happens in their own life. And I see that as incredibly damaging. What I do is I take full responsibility for my own sobriety. On February 24th, I will be sober 26 years without the help of any God.
Powerful stuff. Yeah. So a lot of times people ask me, so where's your data on this, you know? And so I have a website, sheldonhelms.com. You can go there if you want to see the references that I use. But the truth is that the data are scant. And that's because it's very difficult to study a group like Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's because of that second word. They're anonymous. They come to meetings, they're supposed to go to 30 meetings in 30 days. It turns out there's no tracking method for that. So we really can't track the success. However, there are some quasi-experimental studies that show that only 3 to 7% of people actually have any assistance whatsoever from Alcoholics Anonymous and related 12-step programs. So that's pretty dismal when you consider that 93 to 97% of people just disappear from the group, and we can't track them at all, and they probably don't benefit at all. So yeah, that's too bad. So when I decided to give this talk, I spoke to some colleagues, some of them prominent psychologists and fellow skeptics, and their feelings about this last category that I included were mixed. Some felt that it didn't quite fit into a discussion of pseudoscience, and others saw where I was headed with this and agreed emphatically, so it's my talk, so I included it. My feeling is that it not only belongs here, but also it can be potentially more damaging than the other things that I'm talking about. And what I'm referring to here is bad teaching as pseudoscience. Now, we could have very meaningful discussions about things like the validity of the Stanford prison experiment, which I recently just gave up the ghost on completely. My friend Carol Tavros basically just grabbed me by the lapels and said, "Stop it. It's pseudoscience. There was no control group. It wasn't even in a peer-reviewed journal. It was actually in a magazine. There was no hypothesis, etc." So, sorry, Phil, it's bullshit. Then we can talk about Freud, too, and the ladies in this room probably would love to have a good discussion about the inanity of Freud and how people really didn't benefit. For over a century, he reigned supreme, and so we could have meaningful conversations about that. But there's really no excuse for misunderstanding the study that I'm going to highlight here, because this is a wonderful study, albeit unethical. Let's just get that out of the way. You could never replicate this study ethically these days. It was done, and we learned an awful lot about it, about human behavior from it. It's called the Milgram Obedience Study. In 1961, subjects in this study responded to a newspaper ad offering $4.50, which is about $35 in today's money, for those willing to take part in a study at Yale University. Now, they lied. We don't like to call it a lie. We call it using covert methodology. Isn't that clean? So they used a little conversion here, and what they said was, well, you're going to take part in a study that looks at the effects of pain on learning. And so they would flip a coin or draw lots or something like that with 2 people who were going to take part in this study as subjects. Now, what they don't tell the subject is that one of those is not a real subject. One of those is a confederate. That's people who are pretending to be a subject, but they're actually working for the researcher, and they have certain behaviors they're supposed to perform, etc. But you don't know that if you're the subject, right? So they draw lots and they rig it so that the real subject is always the teacher, and the confederate is always the learner. This was not a test of the effects of pain on learning. This was a test of obedience, to see if people would do something that harmed someone else just because some guy in a white lab coat told them to do it. So this is the Milgram Obedience Study. Estimates came in from psychologists and other behavioral specialists that only about 1 in 1,000 people would actually take part in this study. Let me explain the study to you. You would be taken into a room where you would help strap the learner into a chair. You would tie him in. You would then watch as the guy in the white lab coat puts electrodes on his wrists and even talks to you with scientific jargon about the electrode paste and how it will stop the skin from burning, etc. And then you are taken in. Oh, and the guy who's in the seat there, the Confederate, is given some scripted dialogue. He's required to say, a few years ago I was in a veterans hospital and they told me I have a heart condition. So at this point you're thinking, nobody's going to do this, right? And if you ask people individually, each person would say, nope, I'm American, I would not do that, you know, that kind of thing. Of course, I wouldn't be talking about this if they had said that, right? So they're taken into the other room and they're put before the Milgram shock machine. On it is written voltages just above little switches that you're supposed to push, and you're given instructions, and you say, read this list of word pairs, once through, and then the guy in the other room, the learner, you're going to read one word to him, and he has to tell you which word matches with that. And if he gets it right, say yes and move on to the next one. But if he gets it wrong, throw a switch. Starts out at 15 volts. It goes up from there, 450 volts. Yeah. That's deadly. By the way, if you don't understand voltage and amperage and all that stuff, that's okay, because they put little words above them. Things like slight shock, painful shock. At the end, they put 3 X's. Yeah, so they're not messing around here, right? So he really kind of thought of everything when you think about it. By the way, I should also tell you there's an important reason that Milgram was doing this study before you think of a monster. And that's because this was just a hiccup after World War II, you understand? And so people were often saying things like, well, that would never happen here. We're Americans, you know? Germans would do that because they're so evil and all that, you know? And the Japanese kind of evil too. And so, not us though, not us. And so Milgram suspected otherwise. And so he set out to show that if you put the conditions just right, you too might be throwing those switches. So, although this video was a tad longer than I would normally show, I think it's bad practicum to overload videos, you gotta see it. Especially since Milgram took the pain of filming it on the last day. Because he was convinced that if he just published the work, people would call fraud. And they would say, that did not happen, that couldn't have happened, it was too unbelievable. So he brought in a film crew on the last day. So I'd like to show you some of that film that you may not have seen before from this wonderful Dateline.
Going along to get along is one thing, but what if you were ordered to conform and do something against your better nature? Obedience to authority is another kind of conformity, and 35 years ago it was tested to its limits in science's most controversial and shocking conformity experiment ever.
Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out. Let me out.
It's called the Milgram Obedience Study, and what you're about to see has rarely been seen on network television. Here at Yale University in the early 1960s, psychology professor Stanley Milgram wondered whether the Holocaust was a uniquely German experience, or, under similar circumstances, would any one of us have the same capacity for evil? Here's how the Milgram experiment worked. Subjects like this man were told they were part of a study on memory and punishment. Punishment they would deliver to this man from this ominous-looking machine.
This machine generates electric shocks.
The subjects were told they'd have to give the man shocks after every wrong answer in the memory test, and the voltage would increase from slight at 15 to intense at 255 to the unimaginable at 450. But what the subjects didn't know was that the machine wasn't real, and it wasn't a memory test at all. It was a test of obedience, to see if everyday people would inflict pain on others just because an authority figure told them to. The subjects also didn't know that these two people, the man in the lab coat who was running the experiment and the man receiving the shocks, were Milgram accomplices. The man in the lab coat, really a young high school teacher, gained instant credibility with subjects he had never met before, simply by acting in charge and sounding and looking like a scientist.
And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn.
And there was more scripted dialogue, always with the subjects listening in, that raised the stakes even higher.
About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital, and while there, they detected a heart condition.
So now, Dr. Milgram had set up a crisis of conscience, pitting fear of harming someone against orders to obey.
My role was to give commands to the subjects to get them to go to the end of the machine.
The man in the lab coat, John Williams, 35 years later.
When you first saw that machine, did it ever occur to you that someone would go to the very end?
No. This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Get me out of here.
Slow. Then.
Get me out of here. My heart problem. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out.
195 volts. Anguish cries to stop. And they're not the first pleas for help. By this time, the subject believes he has shocked the man with the phony heart condition 13 times.
Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart problem.
Go on.
Let me out.
Let's look at that again. And this time, pay attention to the subject's struggle as he feels the weight of his conscience.
Let me out of here. My heart problem. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out.
He looks back to the authority figure, John Williams, for relief, but doesn't get it.
Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart problem.
Go on.
Let me out.
But instead of walking away, he tells Williams he won't be responsible, allowing him to feel less guilty, yet still obey.
That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich boy.
Let me out of here. My heart problem. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is fast.
Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Burn, car, train, plane.
Silence. Is the man unconscious? Dead? Why won't the subject just stop?
Continue.
Because of the commands to obey.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45.
More silence, putting even more pressure on the subject. Should he follow more commands, or finally follow his conscience?
I'm not going to go further. It's absolutely essential that you continue. Really, I'm not going to do it. You have no other choice. You don't have a choice. I'm not going to go ahead.
This subject finally stopped, but only after blood-curdling screams and deadly silence. In all, he made the decision to inflict pain on a fellow human being 23 different times.
But that subject didn't go as far as most. Amazingly, nearly 2/3 of Milgram subjects, from a laborer to a social worker to a corporate executive, went all the way. That surprised Milgram and dozens of psychiatrists who had predicted that only 1 in 1,000 would obey to the very end.
Which on this Milgram shock machine is past intense, past danger, all the way to a place seemingly too painful and perilous for words.
That's disturbing.
We thought so. I thought so.
And so did Stanley Milgram, who was so worried that no one would believe his results that he filmed the study on the very last day as proof. Proof, he concluded, that just like in Nazi Germany, any one of us could put blind obedience over conscience.
So, it's a powerful study. It's one that is one of a kind. It can't be replicated. Because of his study and because of Philip Zimbardo's prison study, we now have these very strong ethical boards, and we have especially human subjects review boards that will look at your research before you actually conduct it. So we have them to thank for that. Maybe, Zimbardo's pissed off about it. We have talked to him about it. He's like, we don't even have psychology these days. All these boards everywhere because of people like you. So we were having a little fun with that because, you and I, we have the benefit of hindsight, and we know that no one's actually being harmed. Some of my students, when I present this, they say, yeah, but it sounded so silly. The guy's like, you have no right to, he sounds so fake. And I say, if you look carefully, and I show several people, not just the one guy, if you look carefully, you can see that they're taking it very seriously. They're not laughing at this. They think he's really suffering. You can actually see the beads of sweat on the foreheads of a couple of the gentlemen in the video, or in the film, the original film. So they're taking it very seriously. This is, by the way, not pseudoscience. science. This is actually very solid science. So why am I presenting it here? Well, because I became concerned that many of my students who had taken psychology classes before they got to my college seemed to know an awful lot about some of these classic studies, but they had strange ideas about them. So I started to look into this, and I actually have found over the years that I'd rather get a blank slate. I'd rather get a student who says, I've never taken a psychology class in my life, and although it may sound rather conceited and self-serving, you have a blank slate, you can write good stuff on it. But if someone comes to you and has stuff on there that maybe needs to be rewritten, it's hard to erase the old stuff first. So you end up getting students who say things like, oh yeah, I know about that study, that's the one where the guy, and then they tell you this stuff, and you're like, where did you get these ideas from? The internet? No, my teacher. Uh-oh. Okay, so I needed to look into this further. So after years of doing this, in 2005 I actually emailed a survey to high school and college faculty who teach psychology, asking them a series of questions about classic studies in the field, including the Milgram Obedience Study. To my surprise and delight, more than 150 replied, having filled out the survey. Isn't the internet amazing? Providing data from schools across the country. Particularly worrying to me is that 53% of them agreed with this statement about the Milgram study. Milgram showed that it is relatively easy to get people to obey orders to hurt someone. He did not show that at all, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment. 24% agreed with this statement. Milgram showed that most people have an inherent bad side that can lead them to dangerous behaviors. Absolutely not what he showed in his studies. This is a common misconception, as it turns out. In fact, Milgram studies showed nothing of the sort. Milgram studies showed two things more than anything else. Number one, it was extremely difficult to create just the right circumstances to get people to be obedient in this way. And number two, the power of the situation is what led subjects to disregard their own feelings and continue with orders to inflict pain on another person. And by the way, this isn't secret stuff. He wrote a book. You can buy it for like $3 on the internet now. And if you teach psychology, you can read it. It's a quick read. And he tells about all the studies, plural, that he did. The one that gets talked about in psychology textbooks over and over, the one that gets shown on the internet or gets talked about on Nightline or whatever this was, Dateline or whatever, is the one sexy study in which he found 2/3 of people went all the way. But it took him a long time to get to that point. As it turns out, he changed a lot of different factors in his studies, plural. One of them was the experimental environment itself. With the learner in another room, and you can hear, and that's where you get that 65% compliance, where they obey, and that's the one we just saw. But look what happens if you put the person in the other room and you can't hear him suffering. It goes up to 75%. Isn't that interesting? Think about how we fight wars these days. Push a button and a town disappears. It concerns me greatly. Look what happens when you put the person in the same room, though. It drops to 40%. We never hear about that. Also, if you put the person in the same room and you use a shock plate and you force him to actually put the person's hand on it to shock him, you'd think nobody would do it, right? But only 30% of people. That's a huge difference between 65% and 30%. He changed all kinds of factors. Group dynamics, a very creative one here. In a group of Confederates who began to disagree about whether they should follow the orders, they were Confederates, right? Obedience dropped to only 10%. So 90% of people stopped obeying the orders all of a sudden. That one you don't hear about on network television. 20% if the orders are given over the phone, only 18% if the orders are given on a tape-recorded message. When you have two authority figures and they disagree about whether or not you should throw the switch, nobody conforms. Nobody obeys the order. Isn't that interesting? So nobody talks about this stuff, believe it or not, in the psychology classrooms. And that's why Milgram's message gets lost. And I consider that a type of pseudoscience. It's the blind leading the blind. And I know it seems arrogant of me to say, you should listen to me, I teach psychology correctly. But you don't have to take my word for it. You can go and look up Milgram's research very easily for yourself. And so could all those 150 people who answered my survey. And they got a lot of other things wrong as well, unfortunately. So, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. If you'd like to hear more of my ramblings or read any of my stuff, I'm kind of everywhere these days. I'm the board of directors for the Bay Area Skeptics, so I have access to their website. I put stuff there all the time. I'm so happy to be friends with James Randi. It's like a dream come true. Hopefully you all know who he is, and he runs this wonderful organization. I thank you in advance for any donations you may have given to them. I'm foregoing any kind of honorarium or anything in their stead. And if you don't know about the Amazing Meeting, you've got to tune into that. I was lucky enough to be able to be on stage at the Amazing Meeting last summer. It's held in Las Vegas every year. And we have scientists and skeptics come. We got Neil deGrasse Tyson as the main speaker, and Richard Dawkins was our keynote speaker one time, and all these wonderful skeptics and regular people like me too. So you should definitely check that out. And I certainly hope that you join us in November. We have the entire cast of The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, save one. Rebecca Watson's not going to be able to make it, darn the luck. She'll be in Hong Kong, and she'll be flying directly to Australia after that, so she won't be able to make it because she's not traveling with the other guys. But they're going to have George Harab, who is the MC for the Amazing Meeting every year in Las Vegas. And it's just a big live quiz show, music, stupid jokes, wonderful people like us, etc. And so you can go onto my website and jump from there, or you can go, to the Ohlone College website. Tickets are $15, $10 for students. And I hope to see you there. And again, I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much to Professor Helms. Are there questions? Remember, question.
For a consumer, is there some kind of like a certification board or something that you could weed out the kooks and get somebody that practices good science?
I only wish. I've given up on the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association protecting us. They are not in the business of consumer protection. They've made that very clear. I give another talk, by the way, I just gave it a couple of months ago for the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco on gay conversion therapy. They barely spoke out against that, and people kill themselves over gay conversion therapy failure. By the way, you can't convert from being gay. I don't know if you're aware of that. It just shames people and makes them hate themselves, etc. And so, whatever sexual orientation you are, God love you. Yeah, but unfortunately, no. You just kind of have to thumb through the yellow pages, as sad as that is. You can always call me. I'll vet them for you. I'll go in and check them out. I'll pretend to be you.
So I'm curious about with EMDR you talked about a little bit, and you said you were going to present some data about that. And also, in particular, it seemed like Shapiro had a model for that tied into REM and some ideas about connection there.
Yeah, they gave up on that. And that was exciting because I thought, I know about REM. I worked with William C. Dement at Stanford University. We started the Stanford Sleep Well Society together and with a few other wonderful people. And I thought, this could be really great. And nothing. It's not connected to REM. It's not connected to the motor cortex. It's not connected to anything. So, yeah. If you want to find out more bad news, visit my website and I'll link you to a few places where it gets even worse for EMDR. And yet people accept it within the field.
Are there more questions?
You guys are so easy. Oh, okay, good.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, okay. Hey, I got the mic. All right, you guys are trying. But seriously, I read some peer-reviewed studies, and I'm not a psychologist or anything fancy like that, but I've come across a few peer-reviewed studies in psychology and medicine and so on that are terrible.
Oh, absolutely. Most of them are these days.
Yeah, and so I guess, is anybody doing any research on the relationship of the authors of those studies to the people who are actually peer-reviewing, who look a lot
It goes
like
from bad to worse. Yeah. It really does. I mean, people talk about the file drawer effect all the time, and they say, oh yeah, well, I've lost my words all of a sudden. Non-significant studies just get thrown in the file drawer, we never see them. And I say, I'm not concerned about the ones we don't see, I'm concerned about the bullshit we do see. Because there's terrible stuff that gets published all the time in the field of psychology. And I don't know what the cure for that is. I probably would have a Nobel Prize if I knew that. Peer-reviewed is supposed to be your peers checking things out, but then you have to ask, how much do my peers actually know? You know, sometimes the peers themselves are just other accolades. And all they do, acolytes. And so they're like, oh yeah, EMDR, I do it too. And then your peers are supposed to check out your research on EMDR. It's a nightmare. I know. We think you're mad about it. Hi.
So my question was about whether you must be familiar with Robert Trivers' work, and he
tell me about that.
A book about self-deception in human life, and he's done a lot of work on that, and he's very skeptical also, but he seems to have a much higher regard for the so-called placebo effect.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I got into a huge argument with a lady who just hates me over in San Francisco when I gave this talk. She was just mad about me saying anything bad about the placebo phenomenon thing. Yeah, so that's not you. I'm not you, but yeah, the placebo effect thing is something we kind of go back and forth on. I'm in the camp of people like Harriet Hall, who say that it can have some effects, but let's not start calling those benefits and start sort of tricking our clients into fake cures, because that's really dangerous. And there are some countries where they actually will prescribe you placebos in the medical field, and I just do not want to see us go down that road in medicine or in psychotherapy. So I'm not familiar with his research. He may be the one that she was ranting about, but I hope she doesn't see this video. She's really going to hate me. She was just not having it though, man.
So I have a sister-in-law who has a therapy practice up in Vancouver, and she deals specifically with people who have anxiety disorders, PTSD, that kind of thing. And one of the things she uses a lot, which I know nothing about, I haven't really looked into it, is called mindfulness. And I'm wondering if you know anything about that.
I don't know about it, but just the word makes my skin crawl. You know, because anytime you get into like those things where it sounds like they're talking breathy, you know, like consciousness. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say that. It's just that's the feeling I got. So, no, but I'll have to look into that. If you think of it, could you email me and remind me? Okay, you can just, what's that?
I think it's part of DBT, dialectic behavior.
Oh, okay. There may be some validity to it then. Dialectic behavior therapy?
Yeah.
Maybe some validity to it. I'm sorry, I don't know. Yeah, and I'm not a psychotherapist, so I might be the wrong person to ask, but I'd love to look into it.
Now, does being intelligent necessarily inoculate you against pseudoscience?
No.
Because my mom is really smart, but she's fallen.
I am not surprised to hear that at all. My friend, I'm dropping a lot of names tonight. My friend Michael Shermer, you can call him. I don't know why people like me. I'm not that likable, and I have all these famous friends in science and skepticism, and he's amazing. He says that smart people are even more likely to fall for this sometimes because intelligent people can come up with intelligent reasons to believe in bullshit. I would never have thought of that. That's like the last chapter in his book called Why People Believe Weird Things. It's a great book. And so, no, I'm sure your mother's very intelligent. I have no doubt. I also have no doubt that that does not in any way inoculate her against falling for this stuff. Would that it did.
I have a quick question.
Okay.
Can you speak to the predilection that the human mind seems to have for the counter example? For instance, those therapies worked, but they added eye movement, or they added touch therapy, and that extra bit that they added seemed to be attractive to those. This is why people fall for other kinds of pseudoscience. They're anti-science, they're moving toward, what's not in the mainstream. Can you talk about why you think that might be?
Yeah, I think it's probably multifactorial. Probably in some cases it's generational. So, we saw brand new psychotherapies come out in the 1960s because people were so sick of the 50s. They were so sick of Freud. It was the only game in town for so long, generations. And so I think sometimes it's just, they grow up with a certain mindset, but that's mom and dad. And then, they come into a new thing and it's like, hey, that's new, that's different, I like that. And I think that's what made people in the 60s and 70s fall prey to a lot of this stuff. These days, I don't really know. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know, and it borders on cult-like behavior. I guess I better have a better answer next time. I think that's a great question.
Talking about the responsibility and taking the ownership of your decisions, right?
Yeah.
What do you think is the connection between, let's say, people becoming religious and as a form of delegating responsibility to somebody else to give them the solutions? Kind of like in Alcoholics Anonymous, when you're saying you have to believe in God, so he's gonna cure you of alcoholism, for example. Yeah. And it's similar to Milgram, right? So somebody's telling you to do that, so you don't have to worry, you just press the buttons and everything is done, right?
Yeah, well, I guess if I had to draw a line between Milgram study and religion, I would say that you have to have the perfect storm again. And so if you grow up in a family, in a neighborhood, in a culture that tells you this is the answer, giving up your power is the answer, that's a very difficult thing to overcome. You notice that, by the way, I don't know if you guys here know who Dr. Laura Schlesinger is. Everyone knows about her in the Central Valley where I'm from, unfortunately. She's like the second highest rated talk radio host in the country, right behind Rush Limbaugh. And she's often on the same channels as him, Clear Channel. And she has really bad advice. She calls herself Dr. Laura. She actually got her doctorate by studying the gastrointestinal tracts of rats. She has a doctorate in physiology, but she masquerades as a psychotherapist by going on the radio and giving what she calls moral advice. Horrible. So I actually agree with her on one thing, which is like a miracle. Only one thing do I agree with her on, and that is if you don't want your kids to be atheists, don't marry outside your religion. Because there's a very high significance of kids being able, I think, to compare two religions, and then they come out of it the other end and go, no, I don't believe in any of it. So you got to inculcate them better than that. And so that's what Milgram did better than anybody, was he just created this perfect little environment where you kind of boxed people in the same kind of way, and then before you know it, you get the behaviors that you want. Not easy to do, by the way. And you may have noticed it's not easy to keep your kids from becoming atheists these days either. The rates of nuns are going up and up and up. So I guess I would draw that.
We have one more question.
Yeah, sure.
There are lots of diet fads and nutritional tips and all that other stuff. And is there anything in those that you find particularly damaging or just not true? Or
most of them are not true. I'm not a physician, so I probably shouldn't talk about this, but that's never stopped me before. Diets don't work. They don't. Lifestyle changes can work, but diets don't. And so every time we turn around, it's like low carb, low fat, low sugar, low gluten, which is the new fad. You know, it's ridiculous. If you have celiac disease, you know you have celiac disease. Gluten sensitivity has been shown time again to be up here, not down there. Because people who have celiacs and a real sensitivity to gluten, they're not like, oh, I don't want it today. They're like, I can never eat that crap again because it makes my intestines explode on the wall. So these fads are just going to keep coming at us, keep coming at us. So no, diets do not work. We know that over and over again, that people tend to go on them for a while, even if they lose significant amounts of weight. Psychologically, they can't keep that going because it's just not natural, and they gravitate right back to their old lifestyle. So you have to have a lifestyle change, not a diet. But again, I'm not a physician.
Let's thank Professor Sheldon Helms.